So that brings us to radiation dosage. As we all know, computer tomography is gaining prominence among developed countries, while at the same time, concern about the radiation risk that is associated with these scans is gaining numerous amounts of attention as well. According to one national survey, during 2007, approximately 67.8 million CT procedures were performed in hospitals, outpatient imaging facilities, just in the United States. So think about that, 67.8 million CT procedures. This is individual procedures. According to recent National Council of Radiation Protection, or the NCRP, for the United States in 2006, although CT examination comprises only about 17% of all the radiological examinations, CT contributes nearly 49% of the effective dose of all radiological examinations. So, while CT only is making up 17% of all the exams done in the United States, it's a heavy factor in terms of dosage. So here we can see, in terms of exams, CT is only making up 17%, while all the other types of exams make up 83%. However, if you look at it in terms of dosage, all the rest, which is 83%, only comprises about 51% of the dosage. CT is 49% of all the dosage involved in radiology. In conventional radiography, the radiation dose is the greatest as the X-ray photons enter the patient and the least as it exits the patient. In CT, the surface dose is uniform and maximum on the skin surface and decreases toward the center of the patient. If the area scanned is small, such as a head or a pediatric patient, the surface dose is almost the same as the center dose. If the scan volume is large, such as an abdomen or an obese patient, the dose at the center of the scan region can be almost half that of the surface dose. And that's why there's noise or a grainy appearance to those patients who are very large, and why imaging parameters have to be adjusted to accommodate this. However, when we accommodate or make our adjustments, then this further increases the dosage. So here we can see the relationship between the head and the body. As we see, the head, 16 centimeters in terms of just a straight line shot through down to a detector. 16 centimeters. We see that on the surface, the dose is 100, but in the center, the dose is 100, and leaving is 100. There's no difference in it because of the size of the body part. Inversely, the body is very large, and so 32 centimeters. And as soon as we get to the center, we cut our dosage in half, however, only to pick it up as we're leaving. So in the center of the patient, less dosage is involved based on the patient's body habitus. So there are certain terms that we need to understand so that we can kind of comprehend radiation exposure. The first is just radiation exposure in general. It relates the amount of ionization created in air by the X-ray photons. So basically what radiation exposure does is it tries to relate how much ionization is created in the air simply by the X-ray photons. The absorbed dose describes the amount of radiation energy deposited in the patient's body as a result of exposure. So how much is going to stay inside the body, per se. The effective dose, it permits comparison of radiation with differing biological effects. So the effective dose allows you to analyze how much the patient has versus what biological effects might occur. So exposure is a measured quantity outside of the patient. Absorbed dose is calculated from exposure and from estimation of how much energy is absorbed per body mass. So basically, exposure is what it measures how much is actually going towards the patient, and then absorbed dose calculates from exposure an estimation of how much energy is absorbed in the body. So here we have radiation quantities and units. For exposure, we have absorbed dose and effective dose. As we see, the absorbed dose is measured in the rad, while the effective dose is measured in the room. The absorbed dose is measured in gray, and 1 gray equals 100 rads. A sievert is the SI unit for effective dose, and 1 sievert equals 100 rem. So definitely know these two. And for overall exposure, the conventional unit is the Rankine, and we see that many times we still go by the Rankine. So how do we define dosage in terms of CT? The fundamental radiation dose parameter in CT is the CT dose index, or the CTDI. You may have noticed this on some of your scans where you have a dose index or a dosage chart. There are several variants such as volume CT dose index, dose length product, and effective dose. So we see that the effective dose parameter is useful in assessing and comparing the potential biological risk of a specific examination. So basically what the effective dose allows you to do is calculate how much radiation is actually utilized, and based on this type of radiation and the exposure to this amount, what biological effects can actually occur. So the CT dose index, or the CTDI, was introduced in the 1970s, and it represents the average absorbed dose along the longitudinal axis from a series of contiguous exposures. It's measured from one axial CT scan, or one rotation of the X-ray tube around the CT gantry. So basically, it's one rotation of the tube is where the CT dose index is measured, and it's usually measured with a thermoluminescent dosimeters, or the TLDs, and is very labor intensive. Measurements are typically conducted with the use of phantom polymethyl methacrylate, or plexiglass phantoms of 16 to 32 centimeters in diameter. Okay, the CT dose index for smaller anatomy, such as a head CT, the skin dose and the central dose are almost the same, as we've already seen. For larger anatomy, such as abdominal CT, the central dose is nearly half that of the skin. We've already seen that, and so taking this into account, we have developed an equation, basically because of this, for a weighted CTDI. And so what you get here is CTDI weighted equals 1/3 of the CTDI 100 at the center, and 2/3 of the CTDI at the edge. And so basically, as you can see, it comprises most of the dosage from the edge, while only a small portion of it at the center. The CTDI values increases with decreasing slice thickness as a result of geometric efficiency. So that's one thing that you want to put a star beside. As slice thickness decreases, dosage has a tendency to increase. The weighted CTDI represents the average absorbed dose in the axial plane only. And so basically the weighted CTDI is only going to be utilized for axial components, and it's only an average. So here we have typical CTDI values for different slice thicknesses measured for 16 centimeters and 32 centimeters at 100 kV on various scanners. In terms of this, the book uses Siemens. So notice we have 16 sloths and 64 sloths. And so we're going to be looking here. This is the divider. For the 16 sloths and the 64. So notice if we use so notice here that if we utilize thinner slices versus the thicker slices for the body and the head, notice that we're getting much higher dosage for the thinner slices. That even applies here. Notice that we have 12 slices and 16 slices. At 12, we're getting 7.7, and 16, we actually lower it down, even though we're utilizing the same slice thickness. And the reason for this is notice that we have a wider beam here. So we're actually covering the patient more with one rotation. And that's what we have to factor in. Notice here that we have a wider beam. If we have a wider beam utilized, then basically you're getting more bang for your buck, meaning that you're covering a larger amount during one rotation. And that's something that will indefinitely lower the dosage. And we see that here even with even thicker slices. We see that we increase our beam width and instantly our dosage goes down. The curious thing is that the dosage stays the same here for the body. And that could just simply be because of the fact that it is the body and you're basically getting the same measurements or same reason here. But another thing to notice that when we decrease the number of slices that we acquire, curiously, our dosage goes up. If you'll notice, we're utilizing one scan at 10 millimeters. And so you're getting one slice per rotation. Your dosage is 7.2. It is almost the same as utilizing 16 slices at 0.75. It is the same. I noticed that if we use 4 at 1 millimeter, it's 8.5. And so even 4 slices at a higher thickness results in more dosage. So multi-slice CT, by utilizing multi-slice, has really decreased the dosage regardless of what we say. But we've kind of invariably increased the dosage in a way too because we utilize CT even more. So that brings us to volume, CTDI. CTDI volume is the most accessible dose indicator because it's directly displayed on the multi-slice multi-detector CT scanner. It's something that you probably see based on like patient dosage forms, things like that will pop up on your scanner. It's gained global acceptance and provides some indication about the dose delivered to the patient. We see that volume CTI is uniform across all manufacturers, so you know that you can compare scanners based on how effective the dosage delivery are based on this. It can be used for direct comparison of the radiation dose from different scan parameter settings. So basically, you can look at different settings to see which is more effective in delivering the dosage. However, it does not provide an accurate dose to the patient, but rather an index of dose from a particular scanner for a particular examination. So basically, for your scanner that you may be utilizing, it will provide the specific dose for that scanner for this type of examination. However, it should not be used to compare or assess individual risk, and it does not calculate dosage based on how great an anatomical region is covered. So this is the problem with volume of CTDI, and this is what you probably want to put a star by, is that it does not take into consideration whether your scan is longer or shorter. It just it says this is what should be based on the parameters. This is what the dosage should be, and leaves it at that. But the real interesting thing is, what if you extend the scan? What if the scan is shorter? The dosage could be very inaccurate. So we have developed this, the dose length product. So the dose length product is going to be something that you're probably going to see most commonly utilized now, because of the fact that it takes all of this into account, and it takes the number of scans into account. So we found that the dose length product is an indicator of the total radiation dose for an entire examination. And notice it's an entire examination. So it takes into account if you have to scan again, if you have to do something different. We see that it represents the total dose. And I underline that because that's very important. You actually get an accurate measurement for an entire CT examination, taking into account the total number of scans and the scan width. And so it takes into all of this into consideration, so that it kind of allows you to get the most accurate portion, or the most accurate data that you can. So the equation to calculate the dose length product is dose length product is going to be represented in milligray per centimeter. So that's actually what it is. And so if you break that down, you have your CTDI, which is in milligray, or how much a specific exam should take. And then you multiply this by the scan length, or how long your scan actually is. And so that is from the uppermost slice to the lower slice, how long the scan is actually going to be. So if this is, let's say our CTDI is going to be 50, and our scan length is going to be 100 centimeters. So then instantly our CTD or our DLP is going to be 50 times 100. And so that would equal 5,000. And we see that it would be in milligram or milligray per centimeter. The CTDI volume remains the same for all patients because it's based on the standard phantom and single measurement. So remember, the CTDI is not going to change. So if you have a patient who is 7 foot tall and you're doing the abdomen pelvis, the CTDI volume is going to be the same for that patient versus a normal sized adult. However, DLP changes as a result of the difference in the patient height. And so the DLP calculates how much you're actually having to scan. We see that DLP increases with scan length for the same clinical protocol. So you can have two patients that are getting the same exact protocol, and one get more dosage than the other simply because you scan differently. So today, multi-slice or multi-detector CT manufacturers are required to provide or display both CTDI volume and DLP at the end of each exam. So that's something to keep in mind. You will You should see it after the end of each and every examination. Some scanners even allow users to save this information on a separate file called a dose report. And our facility actually utilizes the dose report, so that we can have a record of what the patient's dosage was. So, as the awareness of CT dose and risk grows, the utilization of dose reports will become key in assessing the patient dose. It's not unfathomable to think that in the oncoming years that patient's dosage will be calculated to the extent to where if they receive so much dosage per year, they will not be allowed to have another scan unless it's absolutely medically necessary, unless there's no better way to diagnose the patient. It's not unfathomable to think that. And although dose length product represents the most closely the radiation dose received by an individual patient, still CTDI volume is more useful in comparing radiation dose among various clinical protocols. So the thing that you need to keep in mind is the CTDI volume, it compares protocols. And then basically allows you to see what gives lower dosage per one rotation. The DLP, on the other hand, calculates total scan. Total scan dosage. So those are the two things that you need to keep straight. So in spiral helical scanning, the startup and stopping of the helical scan still result in additional partial rotations at the beginning and at the end, and varies among manufacturers. This is called overranging. So basically how we can define overranging is that when the tube is actually beginning to start rotating around the patient, there is some degree of radiation that is actually emitted before the scan actually proceeds. And because of this, the patient may receive some radiation that is actually not part of the scan. And because of this, it's called overranging. And so if the scan length is very small, the extra scan becomes a much bigger part of the overall radiation dose to the patient. So if you're doing the head and you get extra dosage just simply because the tube is rotating to get up to speed, we see that would contribute a higher degree to the dosage versus doing an abdomen pelvis or chest abdomen pelvis, where this little overranging might be very tiny in comparison to the dosage that's delivered to the patient. And so the reason we're concerned about this is because any extra dosage is a concern, and so we need to eliminate this as best we can so that we can effectively treat and diagnose patients. So here we have the effective scan length. So here we have CTDI volume, and remember DLP equals CTDI volume plus length. cm per centimeters. So we have the CTDI volume. Notice we're doing the chest. So the CTDI volume is 12 milligrams, or 12 milligrade. So we're going to start out with 12. And so if we're scanning for 16 rotations, and we're doing 16 times 0.75 for 16 rotations, we'll see how we calculate that. Okay, so first remember that CTDI is 12. So since it's in milligrade, That is what we need it to be in. Notice that we're given slice thickness and how many slices and the rotations, which means that we have to calculate how much coverage that we're actually getting. So we take 16 and multiply that by 0.75, and we get 12. And this is 12 millimeters. But notice that we have to get it into centimeters. So we divide this by 10 because there are 10 millimeters per centimeter, which then leave us with 1.2 centimeters. You take your centimeters then and multiply it by the rotations. So there are 9.6 centimeters of coverage. So then we take CTDI, multiply by 9.6, and this leaves us with 115.2 milligray per centimeter. So let's erase this and look at the second portion. If we effectively keep the slice thickness the same, but we double the rotation or double the coverage, and that means that we're getting, instead of 9.6, we're getting 19.2 centimeters in coverage. And so if we multiply these two together, see that we get 230.4. And so if you'll notice, just simply by doubling the scan width, we also double the dosage. So here we have an example of the patient's dose length product. So this is something that you may see in terms of your scanner. Notice we have total dose length product here. We have CTDI volume there. And notice for each of these we have DLPs and CTDIs. Also, just notice, know based on the previous equation how to calculate these. So that brings us to effective dose. Effective dose is a parameter that reflects the risk of a non-uniform exposure in terms of a whole body exposure. It's important to recognize that the potential biological effects caused by radiation depend not only on the amount of radiation to the tissue or organ, but also on the sensitivity of that tissue or organ. We see that a radiation dose of 50 milligray to the pelvis and 50 milligray to an extremity don't have the same biological effects as a result of the variation in radiation sensitivity to different tissues or organs. So we see and we know that the pelvis is going to be more susceptible than the extremity is, just based on the organs that are housed in the pelvis versus the extremities. We see that effective dose is expressed in millisieverts, and it's originally designed for the protection of occupationally exposed individuals from radiation. A reflex radiation detriment averaged over sex and age, and its application has limitations when applied to medical procedures. When a patient asks what is the dose from the CT scan, he or she is not expecting answers in terms of absorbed dose and milligrade or so. In fact, the patient is indirectly asking what is the risk from the CT exam. Therefore, characterizing radiation dose in terms of effective dose provides a convenient way to communicate with patients and compare risk from other procedures and or the background. So to calculate the effective dose, we see that the effective dose is equal to K, which is a weighting factor, and it depends on body regions and the dose length product. We see that specific organs and tissues are known to be more radiosensitive than others. And so you use this to calculate K, which is then utilized in this equation. So here we have the typical effective dose values for several common CT scans. CT head, effective dose is 1 to 2. Chest CT is 5 to 7. Abdomen CT 5 to 7. Pelvic CT 3 to 4. Abdomen pelvic CT 8 to 11. Calcium scoring 1 to 5. Cardiac CT 10 to 20. And PET is 20 to 25. So, in keeping this the same, we see that in terms of the chest and the abdomen, we pretty much keep the scan settings almost identical, except increasing the mass here, and which culminates into more dosage. And based on the stomach, receiving 17 milligray, and the effective dose 7.8. So here we have the effective dose in various literature. Head is 2, and the range in literature is 0.9 to 4.0. The interesting thing is the chest is 4 to 18, and the scary thing for pulmonary embolism or PE study is 13 to 40. That's a very high range based on the amount of information that may be acquired from this. So just look at these levels and see how astounding some of them actually are. So in comparison, we have effective dosage for other diagnostic procedures. And let's just compare them. We'll be going back and forth. Okay, so a skull. Just routine x-ray is going to be usually 0.1. Here, it's 2. Cervical spine, 0.2. Neck is 3. Thoracic spine, lumbar spine, 1 and 1.5. Chest x-ray, 0.1. CT of the chest, 7. And then we get down to a barium enema, which for an abdomen is 8. But we also would throw in the pelvis, so we're at 14. Upper gastrointestinal series, abdomen on CT is 8. So we see that there are really no reasons where, if you can get or acquire images that are adequate enough for diagnostic quality in terms of just doing plain film x-ray, then there really is no detriment to it in comparison to CT. The effects of conventional radiography are going to be much more limited. In comparison to what we see in terms of CT. And so it's kind of shocking. So the effects of radiation dosage. In general, the biological effects of radiation are grouped into stochastic and deterministic or non-stochastic results. Stochastic effects are probabilistic in nature and typically affect 10 to 30 years from the time of exposure. So that's something to keep in mind. They're usually defined as long-term risk, and examples include radiation-induced cancers, mutations, things like that. However, deterministic or non-stochastic effects exhibit a threshold dose, below which the effects are not visible and above which the effects increases linearly with dose and are visible within days to weeks. And what we mean by linearly is that the more you get, the more you increase. They're defined as short-term effects, and so basically they happen very rapidly. And examples include skin arrhythmia, epilation, cataracts, and even death. We've all heard the stories about radiation sickness, radiation death. Not very pleasant. And so we see that stochastic effects are of great interest in CT, not deterministic or non-stochastic. The reason for that is because we understand what dosage you have to get to achieve these effects, and so we are attempting to keep everything under that dosage. However, the things that we really worry about is the things that may be coming down 20, 30 years from now. CT has not been around long enough and heavily used like it is today so that we can evaluate the effects of multiple CT examinations. You look at some patients' charts and they've had multiple in 1 year, or even more than just a few, but they've had 7, 8, 9, and 10 scans. And so because of that, what is going to happen? If they keep this trend up, what's going to happen over the course of time? Because we really don't know yet. According to the Beer 7 report, the risk of radiation-induced cancer, or the stochastic effects, is 5% per sievert. And so as we recall, 1 sievert equals 1,000 millisieverts. This means that there can be 5 additional radiation-induced cancers if 10,000 people are exposed to just 1/100th of a sievert, or 10 millisieverts. So if you're exposed to just a very small portion of radiation, you can still feel the effects of it, because we really don't know, because there is no real threshold. Even one exposure can increase the risk of this cancer. And so we really don't understand and really don't know. So the closing chapters are yet to be written for this. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how everything kind of plays out. So here we have the attributable lifetime risk. So if we look at the age, here we have 10, 20, 30, 40, 60, 70, 80, not 800, but 80, and 90. And so if we will see, females are in this dark line, males are in the dotted line. So if we'll see a very young exposure for females at a young age, up till 10, is really going to increase the lifetime risk. And it sharply drops off between 10 and 20, and then it keeps on dropping off. And so basically the risks become very negligible as you get older in age. However, that's not to say that some exposure at 40 years of age wouldn't hurt your body. We can't guarantee that. But what we can guarantee is that the more exposed at a young age someone is, the greater the risk of damage being done. If you'll remember, at a young age, everyone is just growing. And so because everyone is growing, cells are dividing very rapidly. And so anything that kind of changes or mutates that cell, changes the DNA code in it, will ultimately cause that cell to reproduce, and there'll be a chain reaction over the course of flawed cells. Basically, reproducing. And so that is why it's very important that we minimize the amount of exposure that children especially have when conventional radiography can be utilized. So factors that affect radiation dose and image quality. Number one is tube current in milliamperes or per second. The tube current, or MA, in CT implies the amount of X-rays produced in the X-ray tube. Both MA and mass linear relationship with respect to CT dose. So the greater the mass, the greater the patient dosage. The lower the mass, the lower the patient dosage. However, interestingly enough, if you lower the mass too low, the image becomes grainy. So some scanners use the concept of effective mass, and this is the ratio of mass to pitch. And so to compensate for the increase in noise when the pitch is increased, the MA is increased to maintain similar image noise. And so basically what happens is some scanners that utilize effective mass will say that if you're increasing the pitch, we ultimately know that there's going to be more noise on the image. And so we want to decrease the noise. So the way that we do that is to increase the mass. So what we're saving by increasing the pitch, we're losing simply by the machine increasing the mass. So ultimately what you have to understand about this is that the effective mass will probably ultimately wind up keeping the dose virtually the same. Peak tube voltage, KBP. Peak potential difference between the anode and the cathode, which accelerates the electrons toward the anode to produce X-rays. Most scanners use 100 to 140, and the output of an X-ray tube is approximately proportional to KBP squared, and therefore if KBP is doubled, the radiation dose can increase by a factor of 4. Therefore, increasing KBP increases the average energy of the X-rays, which can decrease subject contrast. Increasing KBP from 120 to 140 increases the weighted CTDI from 12% to 29%. So KBP plays a very important role in the dosage that is delivered to the patient. So simply bumping it up 20 will cause a very spiked increase in dosage. That brings us to pitch. Pitch plays a unique impact on radiation dose during CT, as the radiation dose is inversely proportional to the pitch. So dosage is going to be inversely proportional, meaning that when one goes up, the other goes down. Therefore, the greater the pitch, the lower the radiation dose, and vice versa. So just to make sure that everyone understands what pitch is, it's a relationship between the amount of coverage that the X-ray beam is utilizing and the amount that the table is moving. If you have a high pitch, it means that the table is moving faster than the amount of radiation coverage that you're using, so you don't have overlap. If you have a lower pitch, it means that you're overlapping because you're exposing the same amounts of anatomy over and over and over again. So it's easy to understand why pitch and increased pitch will lower the dosage. But as we saw in the previous slide concerning mass, that many scanners have effective mass, which pretty much means that you affect the pitch, and the scanner is going to do everything it can to make sure that the dosage, while trying to stay low, will be adequate enough to produce good images. And so many times changing the pitch doesn't necessarily result in any decrease. Additionally, notice that if you increase the pitch, you decrease the image detail and you increase the noise. So let's make a chart here. So if you increase pitch, you increase noise, but decrease dose. If you decrease pitch, you decrease noise, but you increase dose. Filters. Absorbent materials inserted between the X-ray tube and the patient to absorb low-energy X-rays are soft and to harden the X-ray beam. This increases the average energy of X-ray beam, and so it pretty much decreases the amount of dosage simply because it reduces the scattered radiation and radiation that would never be able to penetrate the patient but only be absorbed inside. Variable MA strategies. These are called dose modulation strategies, and they imply modulating tube current while scanning across different anatomical regions to reduce dose during the CT examination. Basically, it varies as the patient's thickness changes from the neck to the shoulder to the chest and the abdomen. So it understands where heavier dosage is needed and where smaller amounts of dosage is needed, which is illustrated here. We can see this is the distance, or where we're at in terms of location. Here is the dosage on the Y coordinate. So notice that we start off about 75 in terms of dosage. When we get through the skull base and we increase, and then we get into the thinner portion of the neck, dosage dips down to probably about 60. And as we hit the shoulders, dosage spikes to about 140, goes about 150, and then increases up as we go through the chest. And so basically what the machine is doing is adjusting the mass to compensate for whatever area you're going through, so that the patient is delivered the most effective dose that can without over or under exposing. One of the biggest things that contributes to dosage that no one wants to talk about is repeats. Yes, repeats do happen with CT, and if they don't, then probably something is wrong, because there are going to be those instances where something happens, the patient moves, they don't understand the breathing instructions, something like that, and you have to repeat simply because the exam is almost unreadable unless you do. And so with multiple CT scans, the radiation dose to the patient increases. We see that really often. And in certain protocols, CT examinations may include multi-scans, such as CT of the chest with and without, triphasic liver studies. And the thing that we have to look at is how many of these scans are necessary and how many are inappropriate as a critical question with no single answer. But we do know one thing, that the radiation dose increases with each and every additional CT scan. So repeats, we need to keep those to a minimum if we can. However, it's understandable if some do have to be repeated. On the other hand, how many of these scans are actually necessary? We see many things like CT, chest, abdomen, pelvis, with, without. And so depending on how your department utilizes this, you're going to have one without scan, one chest, and then two abdomen pelvis. So this is quite an enlarged portion of the anatomy to expose very rapidly and very often like this. And so the question begins to be asked, how many of these scans are actually necessary? How many are relevant to what we need to see? Also, dose efficiency in multi-slice or multi-detector CT. And multi-detector CT, it's required that roughly equal numbers of X-ray photons strike all the active detectors in the Z direction. The propagation of radiation wasted relative to the overall width of the X-ray beam varies with the protocol used. If a CT scan is performed with a few thin detectors, the dose penalty is more compared with the same scan done using a thick detector configuration. So basically, if we're using very, very thin detectors, we see that you're going to pay a price in terms of dosage simply because of the amount of detail that you're attempting to achieve versus using thicker detectors and yielding thicker slices. So it's all a trade-off we get better image quality with thinner slices, but you get more dosage. So it's a very difficult question, and I don't know whether it's one that really has any answers. So here is a dose comparison. Okay, so your red is your head and your yellow is your body. Notice that when we go from 4 by 1 to 4 by 2.5, we decrease the dosage significantly. We go from 138 to 116, so 16% decrease. We go from 119 to 97, which is a 22% decrease. And the same can be said for pretty much all of these based on utilizing thicker slices. But one thing to notice is that your 16 and your 32 are much more effective than your 4s. And that's based on the amount of coverage that can be accomplished utilizing multi-slice CT, and especially the newer, larger scanners. So that brings up the question of shields. It's kind of a hot button topic. Do you shield or do you not shield in terms of CT? Shielding in the region adjacent to the primary area of CT has advantages in limiting radiation that exceeds the scan region. Studies have shown a reduction in breast dose when bismuth shields are placed over the breast during CT scans of the chest and heart. Overall, the use of patient shields has to be evaluated carefully, taking into consideration such as the logistics for using the shields in a clinical environment. No matter what type of shields are used, there will be a certain amount of internal scatter that cannot be avoided. And so basically, no matter what you use, regardless of if you shield the patient with 5, 6, 7 shields, there's still going to be a certain amount of internal scattering that cannot be compensated for. And so the question still lingers: do you shield or do you not? Many authors will say no, don't shield because it's pretty much ineffective. Others will say it can be effective if used properly. But you also have to remember that you cannot just shield above the patient, but you have to shield below. You have to pretty much put it in a 360-degree rotation around the patient, because the tube is going to be rotating, exposing at 360 degrees. It's essential to minimize the time spent in the CT room during the exposure. Distance is a major dose reduction, simply because dose is inversely proportional to the square of the distance. Because most of the gonadal exposure will come from internal scatter and not from primary beams, there really is no need to be concerned in terms of this respect. Because regardless of what you do, there's going to be a lot of scattered radiation that happens and occurs in this sense. Another thing is patient size. Technical factors set for a CT exam have to be changed based on the patient size. For example, larger patients, in order for X-rays to penetrate through large areas, it becomes necessary to alter technical factors such as tube current and tube voltage. And so instinctively, we're going to raise it up and make it higher so that we can have the correct amount of penetration that is desired for the image. However, this can contribute a significant portion to the dosage of these patients. Age. The risk associated with the radiation is higher for young patients. We saw that in the chart before. Once you kind of reach 40, 50, the decrease in risk kind of go down. The risk factor is 2 to 3 times greater for children undergoing CT for the same dose as that of an adult. And so a child that is scanned, the scan can actually be very detrimental to their health, just based on simple protocols. Sex. The radiation risk varies with sex, especially when certain critical organs such as the breast are in the field. The risks are greater in women compared with men. So basically, women have a higher tendency or a higher incidence of risk associated with CT versus men. Just no one really understands what actually causes this to occur, but it can be hypothesized that it's based on women's size and the organs that women have being more sensitive than men in terms of radiation. Scan length. We see that the total dose is influenced by the length of the scan region. We know that. Taller patients will have a greater dose length product compared with shorter patients, and therefore have greater effective dose values for the same examination. What we need to keep in mind, though, is we don't need to be exposing areas that we're not going to utilize, that are not called for to be exposed. So we need to be very careful in beginning the scan where we need to and ending the scan where we need to, so that we don't overexpose certain amounts of tissue and we decrease our scan length to the point where it's actually viable. So here we have a chart that kind of summarizes everything. So if you increase the tube current, or MA, you're going to have dosage increase. Tube voltage, it's going to influence penetration, and there really is no simple relationship. However, it can increase the dosage, as we saw. The scan time is going to increase pitch. Lower pitch leads to higher dose. Higher pitch equals to lower, leads to lower dose. Thin slices, it's going to increase patient dosage. Beam filtration, it blocks the soft radiation, so it leads to decreased dosage. Scan length is going to increase the dosage. So radiation protection principles. Radiation protection principles deal with justification, optimization, and dose limitation, principles that are vital to radiation protection and regulation. Justification involves the concept of net benefit, that is, there must be a benefit associated with every exposure, and that's something that we need to keep in mind. To perform an exam, there has to be something to be gained from it. The patient does not need to be sitting in the scanner room or laying on the scanner simply just to be doing it, but there has to be some benefits, such as finding out what is causing the patient's symptoms versus not. This requirement is intended for referring physicians. It is one effort to reduce doses to patients undergoing X-ray examinations, and that's something the physicians have to ask too: is, am I going to get enough out of this scan that it is effective and worth the risk for the patient? The concept of dose limitation is a major integral part of the regulatory guidance on radiation protection. This concept addresses the dose that an individual receives annually or accumulates over a working lifetime. These recommended limits are intended to reduce the probability of stochastic effects to prevent detrimental deterministic effects. So hopefully you can see that radiation dosage is very, very interesting in terms of CT, and as CT continues to change, I'm sure dosage will continue to change as well. The key thing to take away from this is that dosage is something that we have to be mindful of. We can't ignore or just pretend like it's not there. We have to be mindful that patients are receiving large amounts of dosage, and that we need to do all we can to help decrease that, so that we're very effective with the radiation that we utilize. If you have any questions, just send me an email. Thanks.